Yeah. All right. All right. Hey everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Andy, and sorry about the technical difficulties. We're 10 minutes late, but fine, right?
That's fine.
Okay. So today I'm going to be introducing Jenny Staletovich. She's a WLRN news reporter. She's the editor for the NPR, and I had something prepared, and I lost it with all the difficulties we're having. But she's covered Florida's deepening environmental problems, from increasing impacts caused by climate change and ongoing efforts to restore the Everglades to invasive species and overdevelopment on shrinking natural lands. And from '89 to 2000, she worked for the Palm Beach Post as a police reporter, right? And from 2014 to 2019, she covered the environment, climate change, and hurricanes for the Miami Herald. So she's got a big background in all this environmental journalism, and she graduated from Smith College in Massachusetts, and she now lives in Miami with her 3 kids and her husband. So please join me in welcoming Jenny Staletovich.
So I have to say, when I called Andy about scheduling this talk and asking like, what's the format, what's the presentation, he said, oh, well, most people give speeches about the research they've done. And they talk about 45 minutes to an hour and go into great detail about their research. I don't have research.
But you've given a seminar here before for the E&E, for the Earth and Environment Department. I remember.
I did.
Yes.
That was a while ago. I don't even remember what I talked about back then.
It was before the pandemic.
Okay, yes, absolutely. But yes, so I'm going to talk about me and reporting, and I'm going to try and connect science and reporting because I think we're both storytellers. And so I am hoping that what I tell you about reporting will help you in the sense of being storytellers as well. I think that's important, right? The other thing though is please feel free to interrupt me with questions. I feel like being in radio and having to interview people live, sometimes the pace can drag, and questions are a great way to pick up the pace. So, do not hesitate if I get to a point and you want to ask me a question about what I'm talking about or just anything. So first of all, just to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Ocala, Florida. My dad was a horse trainer. We moved to Fort Lauderdale when I started kindergarten. I'm gonna jump ahead in time. But the reason I started there is that I wanted you to know I have lived in Florida my whole life, except in college and briefly in Cleveland. I don't know why we thought we could exist in Cleveland, but my husband and I lived there for about 3 years before we realized we made this terrible mistake weather-wise. But as a reporter, I think that's important because it provides a long data set. You guys know that's one of the most important things for science and being able to detect changes and patterns. And I think the same applies to reporting. When you can see changes over your lifetime, it matters, and it provides the context that you need for telling people's stories. Having lived them, I think, for me anyway, it makes me a better storyteller because I can actually reach back into my own memory and kind of vividly explain things. So that's me. And again, feel free to interrupt. And where's the next piece? Okay. So what I cover, I'm the environmental reporter. Like Andy said, I was a cops reporter for a long time. I sometimes like to say that covering the environment is often like a crime scene. But in terms of reporting, it's the skill sets apply. Scientists are like detectives. So when I go out and cover a story, an environmental story, sometimes I see it much like I would report a police story where I'm looking for the problem, the culprits, and the solution. But some of the stories that I've covered recently were Andy's work on the redfish and the finding of pharmaceuticals in our redfish. I do a lot, I didn't always, but I do a lot obviously on climate change. And when I cover climate change, I actually tend to focus more on environmental matters and less on infrastructure and pipes and plumbing and those things. I feel like that's that gets covered a lot in the sense that we have a lot of government reporters and we have a lot of business reporters and I always feel like the environment is getting shortchanged in the equation. And so I feel like as an environmental reporter, I can do the most good by making the connections to environmental impacts. I know we have to write about flooding on our human landscape and in our cities and how we become more resilient. But what bothers me more, or I feel like needs more attention, is what happens to the environment when, well, what do we do with that flooding? I wrote a lot about Miami Beach when early on they were building pumps, and Henry Brassino, who's here, helped. Well, actually, he was the reason I did those stories, because he found that those pumps were actually damaging Biscayne Bay, that the water that was coming off Miami Beach was causing problems in the bay. And to me, it felt more important to point that out than the fact that, oh, Miami Beach is responding to climate change by putting in pumps to drain the streets. So people may not agree with that kind of coverage, but that's the way I see it, and it's my reason. I also write a lot about the Everglades because it is, you know, one of the nation's certainly most expensive, oldest watershed infrastructure projects that affects all of South Florida. It's the thing that's gonna let us keep living here, and it's the thing that's gonna keep Florida kind of like the Florida I grew up in. A lot has changed, but if we can, you know, protect that watershed and not just restore it, but protect it, that matters to all of us. Did you hit?
Just click on the, yeah, take the mouse.
The next pictures. Wait,
Anywhere, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so what makes the story? And you guys may recognize. Actually, he was in the first slide too on the blurry background. But again, like I said, when I talked about being a police reporter, I mean, I look for a problem. It's nice if there's a solution. I find that often you all know what the solution is, but persuading people to follow that solution is not easy. And so I feel like in the story, that's where we maybe do a little translation and put things in more practical terms. Not that you all don't, but making that connection and driving it home and bringing it to people's own backyard is important to do, and the kind of journalism I do. And then the last thing is the most important, which is an accommodating scientist. Okay, which is, as I said, you guys are the detectives. Like, none of what I do would be possible without the work you do. And I'm not just saying that to make you happy and make you like me. It is absolutely true. I mean, I really, my editors may not like it that much, but I really like writing about studies. And when a new journal paper comes out, I find that not only are the findings interesting, but often how you get the findings, and that I think can always be a good story. Not always. Sometimes it's just like modeling and a lot of math, and that is really hard for me to explain. But when you go out in the field and collect the data, there's often a fairly dramatic story, or the reason you decided to do the study in the first place, what prompted the study, can often be a really good story. When I was having lunch with some of the students, somebody asked me what was my favorite kind of work to do. And I said, or assignment. And I said, anything in the field. I will go into the field over any other assignment. And part of that, as I was saying, is that I'm a little shy. I know reporters aren't supposed to be, but doing field work, you can sort of disappear into the story, and you can just let people do their thing and watch them in their natural environment. And often the questions come more naturally. You learn more about somebody watching them than hammering them with questions, I find. And it makes the story that much richer. And again, so if you're doing field work and you want to report it along, you know, I would be happy to do it. Oh,
The media services guys.
Yeah, it's not
Oh.
advancing over Zoom.
Oh.
So it's just.
oh no.
I know. Go for it.
I don't have to start over.
No, no.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, there's.
No, I'm just transferring over to Zoom.
So you should start using Teams.
Hey, define try clicking, duplicate the slideshow instead of swap.
Actually,
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, perfect.
And actually, can I go backwards?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Carousel of slides.
And collapse that. You can make it go around.
So I actually wanted to go back to this one because I did put pictures in these so they could talk about some of the stories and I just raced right through it. So you may recognize these pictures and the top one is blue-green algae from the Staletovich. And that was back in 2017 when the river was having some of its worst algae blooms. That year, actually, there was red tide that coincided came in at the same time. And I may remember at the time, there was a lot of debate over whether or not the algae blooms in the river were having any effect on the red tide. And it became a political issue, became a campaign issue. And I remember the state of Florida started calling it naturally occurring red tide. And it always puzzled me because blue-green algae is also naturally occurring. And I think the distinction was, and the controversy is, we've struggled so much with our water quality and cleaning things up that they didn't want to combine the problems to show that there was a relationship. And so for that story, I spent a lot of time on the Caloosahatchee, over on the West Coast, and then with scientists calling them afterwards, trying to understand if there was a connection and what they knew about it. And one of the first calls I made was to a scientist at UF who's passed away, Carl Havens, who had studied algae in the lake for a long time. And he said to me, you know, what's the hardest thing is that the state has done away with so much monitoring. We really are flying blind. I have to look at satellite imagery, and if it's a cloudy day, I don't get any data. And it was because the monitoring system statewide in downsizing and cutting back science, the water management districts had been under orders to cut budgets for 5 years. The Department of Environmental Protection had been downsized. The Department of Community Affairs is not, you know, scientists, but that growth management element is a part of it too. And he said, we just, you know, we're struggling here. But that crisis led to a better understanding. And I wanted to bring that out in the reporting. So, I mean, when I talk about a problem and a solution, maybe that wasn't the solution, but it was sort of a solution. This middle picture is from recently over at after the ocean heat wave triggered a bunch of coral bleaching, and coral were taken out of the nurseries offshore Key Biscayne in an attempt to like preserve what they could in the diversity and the different, you know, genetic strands that they've been putting out there and breeding to make more resilient. And part of what they were hoping would happen was that the coral would spawn back in the lab, and they did that night. And so in the midst of that terrible ocean heating that was just reefs already decimated by stony coral disease and overfishing and all the other problems, to have rescued coral or transplanted coral spawn in the lab seemed like a good thing to point out. And then that bottom picture with Luke, that was the story that got away. It's finally coming out in a podcast I'm doing. But that's the kind, when I say I like to go into the field, that day was the hardest day I've ever had reporting. We went into the heat monitoring station. Am I describing it correctly? And you can help me out.
Yeah.
Off the main park road in Everglades National Park, but then Luke also wanted to collect some soil borings that you could not get from the boardwalk. And so I think you just told me we're just going right over there. So I thought it was be just like a quick walk out and walk back in. And in my memory, we were out there for at least 4 hours. I could go to a little mangrove island and then come back. I got stuck and had to be pulled out. And I gained a whole new appreciation of field research. I'd been out on boats, I'd been down Shark River, I've been out in Big Cypress wading in swamp water, but I had never actually tried to walk into the sawgrass. And if you haven't done it, you should do it, just so you can see. Luke, I don't think I have the picture in the slide that came out with cuts all over his arms. And I did in the podcast that's coming up include the description of your feet when you lost your shoes. And I think you said it was like 12 tiny cats had jumped all over your feet. So, and then, okay, jump into this, but so the other very important thing that needs to be done, and I often get lost in the science and forget to do it, is to connect stories to the people who are most affected. It's easy to talk about things on a kind of a higher level, systemic kind of way, but when you get out and you talk to people who are suffering the consequences, it kind of reminds you why you're doing what you're doing. And this is Michael Frank, who some of you may have met because he goes to the gear conferences sometimes. But I went out with him to this Everglades project that I'm working on now. I'd done some research on the tribe, and I thought I understood the history in Florida, but I clearly did not. I realized that the reservation was once in Everglades National Park, and that the Miccosukee tribe, I think, was moved 3 or 4 times. And that essentially the way Michael Frank described the way they live and their culture is they're like an island nation. And what replumbing the Everglades did for the tribe is essentially erase their islands. And it for him, and in his lifetime, he can remember living on a tree island and now not being able to live on that tree island anymore. And that's a powerful message that underlies the science of why we're spending so much time and effort and money on Everglades restoration, and the idea that it will happen in his lifetime, that you could actually restore those tree islands in the conservation areas. It'd be something to see. Oh, and then this kind of goes back to why I like to work in the field, which is you also just do a story because it's fun sometimes. I mean, we probably scientists feel the same way, that there can be a lot of grim news, and you can just kind of get lost in it and get down on it. And there is like nothing better than going out in Big Cypress, which these are all pictures from Big Cypress when I went out with a team from USGS looking for pythons. They had attached some trackers at Zoo Miami. And so a couple of days before, I'd been at the zoo and the vet Frank Ridgely implanted a tracker in a python. This one that we were looking at was already been tagged and was out somewhere in Big Cypress. And so they had the, what's the radio telemetry stuff, the thing that they wave around. Sorry, I promise I did report this story really well. But so we went out in a swamp buggy, and then we had to get out where the buggy couldn't go and actually wade into the swamp. And it was amazing to me that they could follow a python, which is hard to see anyway, based on the radio tracking to its location. It took, we left at 7 or 8 in the morning, and it was a good, well, half the day before we found it. And then when we did find it, no one ever saw it. We knew we'd gone through like part, and then we got up to the ferns where there's head high ferns, and the USGS scientists said, it's under us. I know it's under us. And one of the scientists had actually just returned from Burma and had done a lot of work there, and was better at citing them than either the park ranger or the USGS scientist. She was and said, it's over there. We literally, it was like the size of a silver dollar patch of skin that we could see through the ferns, and it was gone instantly. So you try and understand what it's like to tackle invasive pythons. It's probably good if everybody could do that trip, because you'd see like it is, not, as you all know, an easy problem to solve. And what we're doing now, the research they're doing is in the long run going to be, I think, more, it's good that the state does the hunts. It draws a lot of attention to it. But as you know, those snakes are usually just found on levees. They're not being found out in the wild where they're doing the most damage. But it was still a fun story. I got all stories. And then, so, like I said, I used to be at the Miami Herald, and now I'm at WLRN. And so journalism and storytelling is changing dramatically. I think I'm keeping up, but I often feel like I'm not. There's an overwhelming amount of information coming in for readers, listeners, anybody. I mean, we're all online all the time, and it's just hard to keep up and feel like, at least with me, like I've got any sense of order with how the world is changing. It's just too fast and too much, and does this relate to that? What is going on? So I kind of break it down into the biggest challenges for me, which context is always the most important thing, is to connect the dots. When I finish a story and I feel like, okay, I see the map, I see where things go and how it happened, and there's a timeline. I'm very literal. So I like to see how things unfold. I like beautiful writing, and I like, stories, but I just feel like anchor and provide context. I don't mind if you start at the beginning and it's going to be a long story. I would rather know where things came from and how they started than to have to kind of guess. So that's kind of when I'm telling a story, it may bore people, but I feel like it's necessary. The other thing is just like, and I'm not good at this, the engagement and the battle for attention. Thankfully, the radio station has a social media person who does that. It is, I think you see a lot of journalism changing because of these things. I find that sad, and I feel like it doesn't always do justice for anybody. When we're just trying to grab attention, that's not the goal of journalism. And a lot of stories get lost. A lot of really good stories get overlooked because they don't have someone who's an engagement specialist. Like I said, thankfully we have somebody. I think that is a major challenge, and I don't think it's just for me. Science is the same way. You guys are competing for grants and attention, and I think that important science that's not flashy, or it's a shame that it can get overlooked. You probably have discussions about this and how you strategize and present grant proposals and how you write them, and yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is. And then the last thing on the format, I made the switch from print to radio because personally I felt like it was a new challenge for me. Maybe I'd be good at it, maybe not. And I feel like people it's just a different storytelling storytelling format that I feel like now has a lot of potential. It may be that everybody does a podcast and there's too many of them. But I feel like the ones that are done really well, you know, you're being entertained while you're learning something. And sometimes when you are reading, or at least my friend for stories, I sometimes felt like it wasn't that much fun, you know, and that that goes back to the engagement, you know, people aren't really fun, they're just gonna like stop reading or stop paying attention. So, and then this is what I'm working on now. It's the video. That we started out with the cattails where the water is the dirtiest, and then we were going into an open area, the cells progress, so when the water comes in, where it goes out, the water gets cleaner and cleaner.
These are the stormwater treatment areas, right?
And there's
Here a little bit at the beginning.
okay, sorry. So yeah, so this is the big story that I'm working on now that I've been working on since full time, probably February. So that's a long time for me. And it's about Everglades restoration. I am trying to do a report card on the progress of restoration. You may remember a couple of years ago, the 20th anniversary for the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan was celebrated. And there were some stories done that I felt like they didn't really scratch beneath the surface in terms of what's really driving restoration. And I won't go to the next slide because. So again, this is a stormwater treatment area that goes back to the algae bloom. And I just threw that in there because that's what you get when you don't have clean water. This was one of the vegetation managers at the stormwater treatment areas. And actually the top slide is back in water conservation area 3 with the tribe. So to get back to the story, what essentially I'm trying to do is look at the drivers of restoration. If it were just science, I think that we would be a lot farther along as scientists and everybody listen, we wouldn't have just one complete component of, I guess, 68 components of the 50 projects. But a lot of it has to do with politics. It has to do with the stakeholders. It has to do with just this long slog. But you have to drill down into the details to see why those things are broken. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and maybe you can help me with this in doing a long-term story like this that looks at so much time and then breaks it into different episodes. Trying to sustain a narrative to keep people engaged is difficult. There's so much information that it's overwhelming. It's nice that the Water Management District and the Army Corps make a lot of their data available and their reports, but there are so many, and things change over time. So I have felt like to get an accurate track, I need to read them year by year. And when one, the Water Management District puts together this South Florida Ecological Condition, wait, what is it, the SFER? South Florida Ecological, what is it?
South Florida Ecosystem Report.
Yes, and it's like 2,000 pages.
Every 2 years. It's like 2,000 pages on a recurring basis.
Well, there's the National Academy's biennial
Yeah.
report, but then the district itself every year has this report where they do the transparency and cost. And this is what we accomplished this year. And I think that one's every year. The Academy's, which is shorter, is 2 years, and which actually is easier to understand, I find. But so just that the mountains of information, for this project, I tried to go back to the very beginning and the plan as it originated. So I tracked down Bruce Babbitt, who is the Department of Interior Secretary, who kind of corralled everybody into one place and got them to get this thing going. I talked to Rock Salt, who's down here now. He's an Army Corps colonel who was the first Everglades czar after he was at the Corps when they started planning this in the early 90s. And then Bruce Babbitt talked him into coming over to Interior to kind of shepherd the thing through. He retired. If he's not in his 80s, he's near 80. I interviewed him for the story. I can't remember how old he is, but he's still on it. I mean, he's on the board of Tropical Audubon, and he is still fighting to get Everglades restoration done and to protect the blueprint for Everglades restoration. It's just amazing to me that you can grow old working on Everglades restoration. I mean, I feel like I have, but Rock really has. But so. Again, tracking down old sources, a lot of people are not around anymore. And because people have faulty memories, you have to interview many people to make sure that everything kind of lines up. Science has changed. Part of what I kept hearing all along was it's all about adaptive management. As we learn new things, we can pivot and reshape the plan. I think a part of that adaptive management was also to allow room for politics and changing politics, as we've seen in the beginning. Congress, 7 years went by after the plan was authorized, before Congress actually went in and authorized new projects. Another 7 years passed before they authorized a new set of projects. That was 14 years that was really lost. And if you think about what happened between 2000 and 2014 and what we were learning about the world and especially with climate change, the idea that that work was not progressing, it's just lost opportunity. And what I've really come to understand is that podcasts are not easy. That when I proposed this idea, I don't know why I thought you could have a conversational, long form, 6-part podcast series about something as technical as Everglades restoration. It was, I think, a little too ambitious, or maybe I was like a little too arrogant about just how massive the problem is. But again, if anybody has any ideas, I mean, I feel like I've tried to interview politicians, scientists, the stakeholders. I mean, I'm trying to put it all together, and we shall see. Is that the best part? So if you all have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes.
You talked a lot about challenges that you've had. One question I have regarding challenges is when an environmental issue becomes very political, when it becomes controversial even, would you say that presents different problems and challenges on how you go about your writing or how you present a story?
I think it presents problems in that, like, some people won't talk to you, or they're angry with you, or they're dishonest. And it is thankfully, because I cover science, you can usually go to the documents, or you can go to the data, and you have, that is very helpful. But as we've seen, even when presented with data, some people will just still not believe what they're presented with. And that, as we've seen, I think in terms of the political landscape, and certainly the journalistic landscape has changed because of that. You can't come to table and have a reasonable discussion. And there's, in our newsroom, we talk about when both sides get their say, but when one side is saying something that is just factually not true. I mean, I've always, even before it became, since I've started as a reporter, if somebody wants to say something and it's not true, you just say after the quote, this is what it is. This is, here are, this is whatever. You just show the data, you know, and then readers decide for yourselves who you want to believe. But you can fact check in real time in a story. And that's, again, what I come back to again and again is just fact check it. And especially if it's somebody in power or in a position of authority, what they say matters. So you include what they say, but it's your obligation as a reporter just to fact check that and see if it's right or not. So that can add a lot of work. Yeah.
I'm a great admirer of your long-term informed science journalism, I must say. When you moved from the Miami Herald to WLRN, what specifically were the biggest challenges that you faced in moving from print journalism to broadcast journalism in science?
It is time and space. Like a radio story is short. A daily story is 45 seconds, a minute and 20 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if you're lucky. If you do a longer feature, they like to keep them short, so 4 minutes. A really long feature is 7 minutes. That's like no time at all. And I am eternally frustrated at not being able to dive into the science in a radio story. People who are more experienced than me tell me people have a hard time following, you know, complicated stories. One of the first pieces of advice I got was like, don't include any numbers. What? So I have tried to find ways around that. You will often, instead of a specific number, I will say, well, can I say a dozen? You know, can I say a decade instead of 10 years? But that's been my biggest frustration. I like writing. I still like, I think I'm a better writer than I am a radio person. I feel comfortable doing it. I like playing with words and creating images with words. In radio, you have to let the sound is the storyteller. And the people you interview are the storytellers. So while I like that challenge, I've been doing it now for 4 years and it feels like I'm nowhere near mastering it. Whereas writing, I've been doing for such a long time. It was never easy, but it was easier. And I feel like I was better at it. And so that's probably what I missed the most.
There's a question online from Zoom that Henry Vicenia wants to ask you. He's gonna
Okay, well, I see him or?
no, you'll hear him though.
Okay,
Hi, Jenny. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Nice seeing you today. Listen, I have no questions. I just have a comment. I would like to highlight the importance of the combination of scientists and reporters. Because from my own experience, that's the only way we can communicate to a vast audience, a very large amount of people, and not just our colleagues during congresses and conferences. So I think that it's important because you will have, as a reporter, you will have the very candid and very robust opinion based upon science on, you know, whatever of these environmental issues. And on the other side of the coin, you guys translate that knowledge of that information in a language which is accessible to most people, that we usually have a very hard time trying to communicate our ideas with the general public. So I think that combination is important, and I hope that my colleagues use that a little more, being a little less shy of being on the press. And so finally, I just want to thank you, Jenny, for all what you have done, not only for me personally, but for the whole thing of environment and for the media in general. Thank you. Nice seeing you.
Thank you. And I don't know if you all, I'm probably going to embarrass Henry, but the story that I worked on, he got a lot of flack for that. I mean, and it was a difficult story. It was one about water quality sometimes it's good to have somebody like me who doesn't know what's going on ask the questions, because it's, I don't know if it's so much translating it or just putting it in really simple terms that, like, you know, inexperienced people will understand. But that story, you know, he had, you know, had been out sampling. I mean, there was ample evidence. It was published, and I think that I even, like, there was maybe a presentation in Louisiana, and I came back around and did it after it had already been out there. And the city of Miami Beach got really upset about that. They got very, very upset that Henry was finding these problems with the stormwater being pumped into the bay, and that I was writing about it in very simple terms, because while he called it fecal matter, I called it poop. And it was in the headline. and it put it in the kind of, you know, stark terms that that gets people's attention. But boy, it was not easy. When you asked a question about when something becomes controversial, does it make it harder? That was really hard. I mean, they were, the city wrote an editorial about me and my reporting that the Herald published. I had put in records to try and get a better understanding of how the evolution of the pumps happened. And originally there was supposed to be some treatment aspect to them, and then it was removed. And I think they wanted $70,000 for the records. We didn't get them, or actually, did we get some of them? I don't think we ever got all of them. But it was not comfortable for me and for Henry, for sure. he suffered more than I did. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. A project like the Everglades restoration is such a long-term project. 20 years, 25 years, 50 years, who knows, right? How do you sustain that power of reporting, you know, month after month, year after year? So that way people are always engaged. Otherwise, like a 1 time, 2 times, 3 times story on this type of project would not be adequate, nearly adequate. And as you are saying, you know, people forget, you know, things like that. That's my part 1. And part 2 is, you know, what is the measure of your success? You know, when do you know that you made an impact on what's going on?
So the first part of the question, there's kind of 2 answers. Part of the reason I'm doing the podcast is I felt like recent reporting had lost track of the thread of restoration, and people were forgetting about how and why it started and what we were supposed to have accomplished by now and all the twists and turns to get here. We'll see if I'm successful at that in terms of covering it for like the last 10 years. It's sad that the sense of urgency has grown, and you can, for a lot of environmental problems, you can trace it back to restoration in a way. So I feel like if I write about seagrass dying in Biscayne Bay and lack of fresh water, or fish kills because the water management district may have flushed too much water down the Little River. Those little daily stories, you can tie it back into restoration just to keep it front of mind for people. But you also need to provide that bigger context, like, hey, this has been going on for 20 years. We're way behind schedule. This problem, if we kept up, maybe we wouldn't be having it now. And I know I'm like a broken record. I'm pretty sure people in the newsroom wonder why I cover restoration so much. But I think those stories still work. I think that, you know, somebody when I was doing this story said, you know, every time there's a crisis as a politician, you say, and he was quoting from Emmanuel, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And it's awful, but I kind of see it like as a reporter, like, you know, we should have been paying attention to this a while ago. We were, but we just didn't act quick enough. And so maybe piling on, I don't know if it works or not, or if people just get fatigued. That's the other worry. I know, like when I cover hurricanes hurricane forecasters worry about warning fatigue when they changed the threshold for and started doing heat advisories. When I talked to the Weather Service, Rob Moeda is the warning coordinator over there, and he was like, well, we're gonna lower the threshold, but we're gonna see how it works because we really don't want heat warnings and heat advisories every day of the summer. We ended up having heat advisories every day this summer. So what is the balance? I don't know. Do you just say, well, sorry, you're gonna feel some warning fatigue, but we need to have this, or do you, I don't know. I'm not like an emergency manager specialist, but yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I don't think that you not do stories because you worry that people aren't gonna, my editors disagree with me, but I just feel like you have to keep doing it. And in terms of success, I don't know when there's change. I think that after the blue-green algae and the red tide calamity, we saw things change. We saw Evelyn Geiser this year sat on the blue-green algae task force, and it felt like, at least for a while, the state politicians were listening to science. I don't think they followed through on it, but at least they set up the task force. So that's a little bit of progress. In terms of climate change, we still have a lot of people denying the cause. I just talked to the head of the water management district, or the chairman, who said he's still not convinced of the cause and effect. But they have a chief resilience person. And presumably that resilience officer and the resilience team isn't just looking at how do we control floods, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't harm the environment. I mean, at some point they'll get to the understanding that we are causing climate change. And when I asked the chairman, and said, in a project like Everglades restoration, where it's into the future, it's supposed to fix things going into the future, it's based on projections. If you don't address the cause, how is it going to be effective? You're just gonna, you're never going to be done with Everglades restoration if you're not going to fix the cause of the problem. And he said he did. So.
Granville Draper has a question he wants to ask you. He's also going to speak.
Okay.
Well, it's sort of along sorry for my vocal disability, but it's kind of along the same vein. How do you distinguish between what is a single, interesting story and that looks like it's related to environment? It could be a disaster, a flood, and I think this particularly happens with the physical aspects of the environment as opposed to biological. But how do you decide what's a general news story, a flood, and what's environmentally related, as opposed to, and then that becomes your beat, as it were. I was thinking of that this summer, and of course we had floods in Libya, but they were not related to anything climatic. And even the other floods we had may just have been, a bad year as opposed to being part of a trend. Because people, a lot of people were saying, oh, well, you were right about global warming. And I pointed out that, that just because it's one bad year, of course I'm arguing against myself here, it doesn't mean to say it's global warming. Equally, 10 years ago, we had like a 2-week cold period, and then people were saying, well, so much for global warming. So how do you decide when something is an environmental story and when it's just not just, but when it's maybe a disaster story, like a hurricane? It sounds like your bosses don't know the difference, since you seem to have to cover hurricanes as well.
Well, I think I do cover hurricanes, and hurricanes at the Herald were always the environmental reporters. I think when Marty Mercer covered hurricanes, he was not an environmental reporter, but after he left, it became swept up in the environmental beat. I mean, now I think hurricanes are an environmental story, because their impacts, the growing evidence of their intensity, that we know there's connections between the warming planet and patterns for hurricanes. So for hurricanes as an example, I think that is an environmental story with sort of infrastructure consequences. There are stories that have to do with climate change that I feel like are purely infrastructure stories. Now, it used to be nobody was really paying attention so much to climate change. So we ended up doing a lot of stuff that, whether it was health impacts or infrastructure, social justice, all these things. Now I feel like people who cover those beats are better suited to weave climate change into their coverage. I think siloing off climate change in one beat and then having everybody else cover everything else is a big mistake. I wish that we would just weave it through everything, because I'm repeating myself, but the health reporter is going to be a lot better at explaining disease spread related to climate change than I am. I can, talk about why maybe we have invasive mosquitoes, but I can't, I'm not the person who knows as much about spread and treatment and containment and all those very complicated things. So when it comes to identifying what's an environmental and what's something else, sometimes it can just be self-interest. If it's a really good story, I'll just stake it out and say I'm gonna do it anyway. But I really do think that if it falls more on another reporter's beat with their expertise, then they should do it. And if they need any help, if they want to, maybe they don't understand how to explain the connection with climate, I know people they can talk to. But otherwise, I just feel like you're better at telling those stories and putting it into context. I don't know if I answered the question. Yeah.
Turn the equation around a little bit.
Uh-oh.
Towards us, but you have a lot of experience back in the sciences. What could we do better to engage with sort of the journalistic community, which has changed a lot? Better now. So what could we do better to make your life easier?
Anytime somebody just emails me directly and says, hey, I'm working on this project, or I'm about to publish a paper, and it's here in it's related to South Florida. I mean, it's got to be sort of local. Our radio station extends from Palm Beach County to Keys, but I get so many blast emails and so many sort of press releases that it's from an individual, and immediately I read it. Because I think if somebody took the time to send me an email, then it's going to be worth something. So, I mean, it's a simple email, or I'm still on Twitter, and you can message me on Twitter, but email always works, or I think I have my phone number on my email too, so you can always text it if you've gotten an email from me. In terms of sort of selling the story, make it simple. And what's the bottom line? Like, I will often, if I see a title of a journal paper, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, then I just jump to the last page and see what the conclusion says, because I want to know, just like, what is this something that is going to be simple to explain? Like, while I said our job is to tell complicated stories, so we shouldn't do things just because it's too hard or we don't think people are going to read it. On the other hand, you want to report news, and so sometimes just the simple news is helpful. The other thing, and selling a story and getting more traffic, especially on radio, is office interviews, Zoom interviews will get you like 45 seconds or a minute. But if you can go into the field and I can actually see the experiment, I know that doesn't always work, or see the results, or connect it to something. That's huge. It's time consuming for you, but in terms, and I think that works with print too. Anytime you can tell a story or show a story, but not tell a story. And so those scenes add up. It makes it more interesting to read. It certainly makes it more interesting to listen to. I mean, a car door slamming, you know, would you, okay, now where are we? I mean, just really easy things in radio. There's like these little signposts that you probably hear them all the time if you listen to stuff. And there's a reason they're there because they're kind of like end scene, next scene, you know. So is that helpful?
Do you have any role models for what you, for your career, what you want to do?
I have role models and really great writers. You know, Floria's had some of the best environmental reporters ever. My editor at the Herald, Curtis Morgan, he was such a great writer. Just wrote these really compelling stories, was really good at writing about nature in a way that was very tangible. I mean, that's what I always try to do, is make it literally tactile. If you can make a person feel how the sawgrass cut your arm, or you know how you get stuck, or what a bird sounds like, or something, and he was a master at that. Juanita Green was another Herald reporter who went beyond reporting to actually, you know, become kind of the Biscayne National Park. I mean, she like got things done that I feel like that, you know, I don't know that modern journalism allows that. I mean, I try and build firewalls between, you're not activists, we're reporters, you know, we report, you discuss, you know, if there's going to be a consequence, it's up to the reader. I like Lucy Morgan, who just passed away, was a reporter for the St. Pete Times for years and years, and she's one of those tenacious reporters who just never took I don't know for an answer, and was persistent and dogged in a way that I think modern journalism could use a lot more of. I rely too much on email and texts and stuff. Just pick up the phone and call somebody and like go meet with them. You get so much more out of a story when you're sitting across from somebody and you're talking to them face to face, and you can see their expression. And people are more comfortable. Ultimately, our job is to get an explanation. You know, it's to be able to tell people things. And if you're just, when I started in reporting, you would have never taken a written statement. That allows people to craft their answers in a way that, and you're not getting to ask questions back. But now we do that all the time. There's great. I was thinking when I was putting together this slideshow, Jimmy Breslin had this great story after JFK's death where he went and found the grave digger. I mean, that's what we should all, you know, those stories, like go where other reporters aren't going. Go find the person that nobody's talking to, because they often have like really amazing things to say. For this Everglades story, I went and found a beekeeper in LaBelle, because I wanted that LaBelle and the Caloosahatchee was where the first incision in the Everglades was made. And this connected Lake O and Lake, I'm gonna pick a P, and channeled the Caloosahatchee. LaBelle was born, you know, and so they've been waiting for restoration, you know, from the beginning. Not everybody there wanted restoration, but it is a place that has seen a lot of change. And this was a third generation beekeeper. And she was just such a great storyteller. And she didn't know necessarily the intricacies of the politics, but she knew what it was like to live on the ground and play in the river when she was a kid and swim in the river and what it's like now. And again, I say I like to go out in the field, but actually literally going out into the world, you know, is where you get your I gave you a couple of examples, but I'm sure. Oh, I'm new to it, so I don't, and it's radio broadcast. I don't have any answer. I should, I better find one.
We have time for one more question and then we have one over Zoom. So if you want.
This is kind of an observation that I thought, I've kind of been thinking about it for a while. I've been down here about 30 years and this has been going on for that long as far as the observations. And Florida's population, of course, has increased by about 50% in that time. So it seems to me that it's an ongoing problem with regard to naivete or ignorance on the part of the population. There's always new people to educate about this. And the other thing is, you know, people's reference is completely different. I mean, I remember the times when there wasn't a heat advisory every single day in summer. We turned our ACs off in September and not back on until May. And now for these new people, oh, this is the norm, but it's not the norm. And I guess I kind of wanted to point that out and get your reflection on it because, you know, where I grew up in upstate New York, the county I lived in has 100,000 people less than it used to. And this, we have this population that's just from all over and ignorant, basically.
It is a huge problem. It's like, that's why you have to tell the same story every day again and again, because there's somebody who hasn't read it before. And it's a multi-pronged problem. So while you have more and more people who don't understand why restoration matters, why Florida's environment matters, how dependent we are. I mean, I walked into the newsroom and people understand that the Everglades are important, but not everybody knew that it's our water supply. I mean, sort of basic things that you just assume people know. But if you moved here, you know, a year ago from Nevada or upstate New York or someplace, maybe you don't get the connection, and people are busy with their lives, you know, right? They're not everybody gets to be an Everglades expert because it takes time. So that coupled with the splintering of journalism and so many sources of information make it difficult, and the baseline, you know, like I didn't have air conditioning growing up in Fort Lauderdale. We had like one window unit in my mom's room, and we didn't have air conditioning. Granted, it's a little hotter now, and just a couple of degrees makes a difference. But, you know, my kids if our air conditioner goes on the fritz, it's like, you know, the end of the world. And they think that I'm just old and cranky when I talk about not having air conditioning, but we lived a little differently because there were, you know, 5 million less people. So. But yeah, I mean, it is that makes it really complicated, and also all the more reason why, like, you can support local journalism. I mean, that it is really important to have these local stories told locally. I mean, I could make any big point. I guess that's what I've been saying kind of over and over again.
So last question is from Monica. She's asking, what % of your stories get blocked from becoming public due to political and economic drivers?
I don't think any. I mean, I'm not really sure what the question is. Like, would my bosses say not to do a story?
Yeah, is there some sort of like a political thing that would prevent you from putting out a story?
I've never had anybody say, no, don't do that story. I know that, like, when writing about the Miami Beach pumps and the response we got was not pleasant, but Mindy Marquez, who'd been the Herald editor, she's, I forget, she's a publisher now, but you know, she was like, whatever you need. So that was never a problem for me.
Yeah. American democracy still works.
Well, everyone, thank you for coming. Let's put your hands together for